And then we'll get back to kind of where we left off with the fruit of the Spirit. But I always struggle to come up with a name. And so it was peace. It was peace, the peace of God. Last week we talked about rest for a weary soul. And this, how we long for peace. And so we're all going through these changes that happen as we get older, and as I look around, we're getting older. I hate to break it to you. I know. As I age, though, in life, I am renewed in my spirit, and it's pretty incredible. The lesson today, I've titled it Mission Impossible. And we know from growing up, Mission Impossible, the TV show, and then they made movies out of it. But really, this Mission Impossible is being asked to do something that's really an impossible task. The Expendables, that idea that somebody would stand up and say, yeah, I'll do this, knowing full well that it's a suicide mission. You're not coming back from this. But in our minds, we always think, yeah, I'm the one that'll break the mold. And we certainly do cheer on the hero, right? The hero that can overcome the mission impossible and get the job done. But when we hear Mission Impossible, maybe we might react by saying, why try? That's one of the big things. The theme of the week, by the way, was living like Jesus. And so that's where this idea is coming from, is can we live like Jesus? He's called us to live this holy life, and can we do it, or did he give us an impossible task? And if in our minds we say it's an impossible task, we mentioned a little bit this morning in our study in John this morning, that so many times as we're walking this path and we're trying to draw closer to God, we get discouraged and we wonder, it's not meant to be. I want to suggest something to you that I only recently came to understand in my study of just the history and the migration of the church coming to the Americas and the early settlers, that they were predominantly Calvinists. I never knew that. I don't know why, but I just never knew it. And so for us here, as we study church history and we understand some of the Cane Ridge revival and the Restoration, the Reformation, we talked a little bit about it over the spring, and there were people that had come here and established churches, and we're seeing these early settlers moving across the plains, and they were converting them. And so to the Calvinist view, you can't convert somebody. You're kind of predestined. You don't really have a choice in the matter. So church was really kind of established for those to come who are called in a special way. And so I would imagine this is kind of fatalistic. It's kind of a fatalistic view to my way of thinking. But there are so many subtleties in the exposure in the religious world that we have, that, like I mentioned one this morning, the prosperity gospel. This idea that if you will give everything over to God, he will prosper you in special ways. But beneath that, there's this underlying current, and I mentioned I saw it a lot with couples, where it would be very divisive in a husband and wife relationship, where one would start adopting this attitude, well, we're not moving on because you must have some secret sin. You see the danger in that and the destructiveness in that? But we don't think that we're immune to this. If we're confronted with an impossible task, our tendency is to adopt a hopelessness attitude. Well, why try? In other words, God is asking us to change and live for him. But if I struggle with the change, am I just not good enough? Am I not getting it? Am I not worthy And if I adopt the world view on this, then I could easily get into despair and hopelessness and say, I'd rather just go back to eat, drink, and be merry for tomorrow we die lifestyle than pursue this. This is really too hard. And so I want today to be an encouragement, and I've chosen out of Hebrews. We started this study in Hebrews chapter 7, but Hebrews again is addressed to these Hebrew Christians, those who had really put everything on the line to follow Jesus, because they were going to be disavowed, disowned from their family, from everything. You know, your synagogue life, your work, your inheritance, everything is tied to the traditions that Israel was living under. And Christ calls us out of that, but for them it would be really difficult. And the writers that are presenting this message to the Hebrews are really appealing to them, I believe, right before the destruction of Jerusalem, where Jesus foretold that not one stone was going to be left upon another. And these Hebrew Christians need to really understand, before the temple is destroyed, to not go back, even in your heart, to not go back to the law, which they say made nothing perfect. And so the mission impossible for us is we're asked to be holy. We're to be holy like your heavenly Father is holy. You're to be perfect like he is perfect. And that's I think, an in for this destructive thought. Well, you can never be that, so just give up. Don't even try. Okay? So, let me give you an example. Matthew 5:48, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and he says, you must be perfect. And by the way, that word perfect is complete. Think of this, almost you can interchange these words. You must be complete as your heavenly Father is perfect. In 1 Peter, this is when I was thinking of 1 Peter 1:15 and 16, he says, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. And again, that sense of holiness is being glorified. To be glorified is to be perfected in God, who is holy. And so Paul wrote to the Ephesians in 1:4, even as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before him in love. And 2 Timothy, Paul wrote to Timothy in 1:9, saying, who saved us and called us to a holy calling, not because of our works. I want us to see this, not because of our works, but because of his own purpose and grace, which he gave us in Christ Jesus before the ages began. So in this setting, so we're given this mission impossible, because for us, as I mentioned this morning in class, Jesus, they're saying, Jesus, you can't bear witness about yourself. He says, yeah, I can. And he says, I can bear witness about myself, and I do at this point. But he reminds them of the law. And so in their own law, you have to have 2 or 3 witnesses. But he says, I tell you, I bear witness about myself, and the Father bears witness by the signs that accompanies. But it was even greater than that, as we discussed this morning, because when John presented the gospel as he recorded it in John chapter 1, the predecessor to Jesus was John the Baptist, who bore witness to Jesus. And where did he get his testimony? They questioned him about that. What authority do you have to baptize? And he got it from God. Jesus himself reiterates that to them. But in this Hebrew passage, if you go back to 7:11, he says, now, if perfection, and by the way, or completion, had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than one named after the order of Aaron? And he's comparing, he started this, back at the end of chapter 6. He was given this example about how the promise to Abraham came before the law, and then as he's talking to them, he reminded them that after Abraham had met with the three kings and dispersed them or dispensed with them, that he meets this Melchizedek on his return, and he pays a tithe to him. He gives him a tenth of the spoils. And so now the Hebrew writer is building on that experience. And so how can somebody as great as Abraham, who received the promise, pay a tithe to someone else? Where clearly he says it's undisputable that the inferior would give the tithe to the superior. So that's where we're building off of. And so he's leading the Hebrews, which came through the law, and he says the law made nothing perfect. It's reiterated in 7, verse 7:19. For the law made nothing perfect. The law can't make you perfect. In fact, the law was there to show you that you could never be perfect. And yet they were still told to be perfect. You be holy as I am holy, God would say. But now they have this priest after the order of Melchizedek. And so now something interesting about Melchizedek. Melchizedek is a priest king. It just translates, back when we meet him in Genesis, it just translates when Abraham meets him. He's Melchizedek. He's the priest. He's the priest of God, but he's also the king of Salem, which is the king of peace. Thank you, Claudia. Peace. The peace of God. And so, but now Jesus is being related to having this priesthood now on the order of Melchizedek. And what's the difference? The writer's going to go on to say it was under the law, the priesthood, the Aaronic, we call it the Aaronic priesthood. Well, Aaron is a Levi, but he was also the first high priest, and then only a high priest could be in his bloodline, a son of Aaron. And so they were always going to be a succession because men die. And so as the man dies, his son would have to step up and assume that position. And so, but they weren't priests by an oath. That's the argument that the writer here is making. They were priests by the law. So when the law was given to Moses, Aaron was set up as a priest. The Levites, his tribe was going to be the priesthood for the tribe, and then the high priest would, have the succession under Aaron. But it was under the law, and the writer's here saying, but the priest forever is a priest by oath, that God made an oath. He swore, right, that he was going to make him priest forever. And so that was 7:17. In Hebrews 7:18, for on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God. And it was not without an oath, verse 20, for those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath, but this one was made a priest with an oath, and by the one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind, you are a priest forever. This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. And so the way the writer kind of is trying to communicate this to the Hebrews, it's one thing, I guess, to accept Jesus as the Christ. They can't deny his indestructible life that he resurrected, but accepting him as a priest and leaving the sacrificial system, that's hard. We talk about this a lot, Alan, right? We're used to, we grow up in a certain system, we become, Josh, habitual in it. And we know how hard it is to change the traditions that we've had. And he's saying, listen, verse 23, this is 7:23. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. So as they would die, the son would come up. But he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. Now this is where Alan read. Our reading today starts in Hebrews 7:25. And by the way, I really enjoy this. As you have people come up here and present scripture to us, I love the time that we're living in. Some would argue that it's a good thing that we all have the same version of the Bible. And I just love the fact, especially in Bible study, when we study the Bible together, that we have all these different versions. The challenge to a translator to put these words into English to communicate or convey this message, if you were learning the Greek language, your instructor would say, how would you translate that? And I look, that one looks pretty good. That one looks pretty good. I could go with that. I could see that. Alan said, therefore, and in the ESV it says, consequently. So because of that, we get to this, 7:25. He is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. So in Jesus going to the Father, prior to this we had, I think it's in chapter 6, where he says we have this anchor for the soul. Where is that anchor moored? It's in heaven. The Hebrew writer would say these are what we have in the sacrificial system in the earthly temple for Israel was a shadow or a copy of those things that the reality is actually in heaven. Well, Jesus goes and he presents his sacrifice in the heavenly temple, where now we're told where that's the anchor for our soul. And I love that image. But he lives. So in other words, how do we know Jesus' sacrifice was sufficient? Because death couldn't hold him. That's already been discussed here in this Hebrew letter. Death couldn't hold him because he satisfied the law. He was the sinless one that was the perfect sacrifice. So death doesn't hold him. He resurrects. And that resurrection, again, fact of human history, that Jesus came back and presented himself alive in the flesh. Remember, he says, hold me. Can a spirit eat? Can you touch a spirit? He came back to let us know that death no longer has its hold on the one who conquers death. And so he lives. But more so, he makes intercession. So again, it's a hard concept under the tradition of the law of Moses to have to make a sacrifice. You know, it is comfortable to live under a legal system. Oftentimes, we want to know, where's the dividing line? God, just tell me. The problem with the legal system is that we can use that system to abuse our brothers and sisters. Because we can never hold up to a legal system. We like it. It's like a warm blanket. It's comfortable knowing. And especially for those, I remember an instructor saying, you know, those two personality types, one likes to go through the mud hole and the other one just watches and learns from him. I'm the mud hole guy that has to go in it. And you know, the other one just, yeah, well, I'll learn by watching you. But it's comfortable. These are the laws, Tom. If you just follow laws, you don't have to go in the mud hole, right? But it's there. You know, I got to experience it. But having the law to the Hebrew was a comfort. I do this. It doesn't seem right that I can just pray to the one who lives forever and he'll intercede for me. I feel like I have to do something, and it goes back to my point earlier. Now the guilt. I'm not good enough. If I don't do this, I'm carrying the weight of that guilt around. To come out of that system and accept Jesus is to confess to Jesus, and he makes it okay. Verse 26, it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. Well, you might say, mission impossible. Well, that's good for him. He could do it. But what does that do for me? How do I accomplish this impossible mission? And I mentioned this morning, Mary Ray, in class, when Jesus is presented, he says, I'm the light of the world, and they're questioning him, and he says, I know where I came from, and I know where I'm going. Well, that's great, we might say, Jesus. You have a lot of confidence. You know for sure. But I live in a world of doubt and insecurity and fear. I may present a good, tough exterior sometimes, probably not, but I'm not. I'm struggling. I'm weak. I mess up, and I don't have that confidence. And I said, the anchor for the soul. We need to get that confidence, and we need to understand it, and we need to remove this stumbling block out of our way that the world keeps putting in our way. You're not good enough. You never can do it. Why try? Okay? Jesus accomplished this, and he's far above. And we might say, that's unattainable. It's out of reach for me. Well, in verse 27, he says, he has no need like those high priests to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins, and then for those of the people. He did this once for all when he offered himself. I think this is the hardest, well, when I say it all the time, right? Everything's hard. Once you accept that, I think things get easier. It's hard for us to imagine Jesus accomplishing this. And again, I'm trying to think like a Hebrew in our Hebrew class as we're studying this. That sacrifice that we were working toward, that as we went in and we offered the sin sacrifice and the scapegoat, and we felt better about ourselves and about our relationship with God, but then we convict ourselves almost immediately by thinking a bad thought, and now we're walking around really unclean again. But Jesus accomplished this for all and took away that barrier. It's not that we don't need to understand the law and have a good guideline, but if we're going to fulfill God's purpose that he has for us, we need to remove this stumbling block of perfection. The challenge here, and I love getting together at a retreat like this, because the New England mindset is, I'm all set. I got this. We have a saying here, if you want something done right, I ask somebody to help me, and I end up working twice as hard. Right? I'm all set. I don't need any help. And, we need help. I don't need church. I don't need to go to church. I can worship my God myself. The church is what Jesus died for. Verse 28 says, the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests. But the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. Okay, Tom, well, that just really puts it out of reach for us, doesn't it? This mission impossible. Here's why we're here on the first day of the week. And in our lesson of living like Jesus, we're assuming mission impossible. It's an impossible task. And I'm speaking to myself always, but to New Englanders at large. As I talk to different people, especially older people, I was really surprised to hear this from one of my aunts, because she sounded just like me. I guess I come from boys. I don't think girls struggle with the same things. But my aunt said to me, I always did everything for everyone else. I don't need anybody's help. And she doesn't like asking, bless you, she doesn't like asking for help. Boy, I struggle with that. When I got into business with my dad, this just drove me to almost despair. The realization that I cannot do this on my own, that I have to ask for help. I never knew how tough that was, even in my own life, because I got this, I could do this. And my dad would just shake his head, you're not doing so well. But I couldn't hear it, and I'd fight him. When I heard my aunt say that, boy, that's a tough barrier that we have. In John 17, it's one of my favorite passages. We're going to get there in our study. John 14 through 17, in Jesus' intimate time before his trial. And he's speaking with his apostles, and then he prays over them in John 17. And starting in verse 16, he says, he praying to the Father, he says, they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And for their sake I consecrate myself, that they also may be sanctified in truth. I do not ask for these only, but also for those who will believe in me through their word. The two bookends to this in chapter 14 and chapter 16 were 14:27, Jesus comes to them and says, peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. And he closed this section in 16:33. I've said these things to you that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. If I could get to the point, Mary, like this morning where Jesus says, I know where I came from and I know where I'm going. Brothers and sisters, we have this anchor for the soul to know where we are going, so that in him we can accomplish anything. We can make this mission impossible. We can be holy as he is holy, because he makes us holy if we will accept what he tells us. And we need one another to accomplish this mission. And so the instruction here is from Paul's letter to the Romans. It's famous verse. You've heard it preached on so many times, and it's the inoculation that we need for the disease that we have, which is sin, and we inoculate ourselves with the gospel, but it's his word that sanctifies us. In Romans 12:1 and 2, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Well, Paul, how do I do this? Well, listen with both ears. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. We're not perfect, and we're never going to be perfect. Paul, do you think Paul wanted to be perfect? I think he was so intense. I really do think it was hard for people to be around him. And some of them came back to him, some of them left, and they came back to him. But Paul himself was praying to God to take this thorn out of the flesh, and God wouldn't do it. He said, my grace is sufficient. We're all, he said this morning, though, as our body aches, as time wears on, I am struggling in the flesh, but I am being renewed day by day in the Spirit. We want to help our brothers and sisters in the world today, help them get over the stumbling block of perfection. We're perfect because Jesus makes us perfect. And we can accomplish anything because he has given us his Spirit to do so if we'll accept it. And I went up there this weekend to present the school, of course, and one of the struggles that we have in working with bringing students here is getting men in New England to accept support, to ask for help. Not only do they have to accept the support, they have to ask for help. And in doing so, become an example to others. Jesus says, I can't do this on my own, but I can do what the Father shows me. We can't walk this walk successfully and sing this song that the whole gospel message that was just played out for us. We know it in our hearts, we have it in our minds, intellectually we understand it, and then we leave here and the world beats us back down again. Look, we talked a little bit this morning, there are convergence here with the Word. My appeal today to get us to live like Jesus is to accept Jesus and the work that he's done for us. He does see us as perfect if we just trust him, if we can start seeing ourselves as perfect. But if we can make time and commit ourselves to have some convergence where we get involved with being in the Word with brothers and sisters in any form, and then start there and build on that. And so I remembered a song here that we used to sing, Where's Alice? Where's Alice? I learned these songs from Frank Belizzi because I never knew any of them. He invites us into his banquet table, his banner over us is love. And so that's why we're here at the first day of the week, is to be reminded he's the perfect one. He's the one that makes all things possible. Let us renew our trust in him this day as we partake of this memorial and we sing these songs together. Thank you guys. I wish I could bring the spirit of the workshop back, but I hope I gave you a little piece of it. So Q has another song picked out that I love, and it's one of these camp songs. I have decided to follow Jesus, that we have a great lesson, which you can get vicariously through me from others. But now we can sing this song. Please, if you're struggling with something that you need the prayers of the church, please make them known, and we'll pray about them. But let's stand and sing this invitation song.